The final words I heard her say before my world fractured were spoken with a light, dismissive laugh. She was in the kitchen, her back to the open patio door where I stood, hidden by the shadows of the late afternoon. She thought I was still at the site, wrestling with a concrete pour that had gone wrong. But the supplier had solved the problem faster than expected, and I came home early, holding a small bouquet of freesias, her favorite. I was going to surprise her. The surprise, it turned out, was all mine. "He's a good man, Mom. A good provider," she said into her phone, the tone a mixture of pity and contempt that curdled the air. "But my husband is so naive. He doesn't know he's not the biological father. He just builds his bridges and trusts that everything at home is perfect." It's almost sad. Have you ever had a moment where the world just stops? Where the sounds of the birds, the hum of the refrigerator, the very beating of your own heart seem to fall silent, leaving only a ringing in your ears? That was my moment. The freesias slipped from my hand, landing softly on the flagstones. "My name is Thomas. I'm 42 years old, and I'm a civil engineer. I build things. I design foundations, calculate load-bearing capacities, and oversee the slow, methodical creation of structures meant to last for centuries. My life, until that moment, had been built on the same principles: stability, integrity, and a belief in the solid, tangible things you can trust. My marriage to Chloe, I thought, was one of those things. Our son, Leo, was the cornerstone of it all. But in the space of a single sentence, I learned my entire life was a structure with a compromised foundation, and I was standing right in the middle of it as the cracks began to show. But let me start from the beginning. Chloe and I had been married for 10 years. We met in our late 20s. I was a junior engineer, and she was working in marketing for a luxury brand. She was vibrant, ambitious, and saw the world in a way I didn't. Where I saw concrete and steel, she saw status and aesthetic. I was drawn to her energy, and she, I believed, was drawn to my stability. I was the calm anchor to her glittering ship. We were different, but I thought we complemented each other. I loved her with a quiet, steady devotion that I expressed not in grand gestures, but in the constant, reliable act of providing a safe and comfortable life. I worked long hours, ensuring every bill was paid, every need was met, so she could have the life she wanted. For the first few years, it seemed to work. We bought a beautiful house in a quiet, respectable suburb. I put a significant down payment on it, a sum that came from a family inheritance I rarely spoke of. Chloe decorated it with impeccable and expensive taste. I never questioned her spending. My salary was good, and the portfolio my grandfather had left me provided a substantial cushion. I saw it as my duty and my pleasure to give her the world she craved. When Leo was born 7 years ago, my world solidified. Holding him in my arms for the first time was like placing the final, perfect keystone in an arch. He became my everything. My purpose was no longer just to build bridges of steel, but to build a future for him, a legacy of safety and love. Over the last couple of years, however, a subtle discontent had begun to creep into our lives, emanating from Chloe like a low-grade fever. My work, once a source of pride for her, became boring and predictable. My practicality was reframed as a lack of ambition. She'd make comments after we'd been with her friends, whose husbands were investment bankers or tech entrepreneurs. "Did you see the watch Julian was wearing?" she'd ask, referring to the husband of her friend, Amelia. "And their place in the city is just divine. They're thinking of summering in the Hamptons." Her words were always casual, but they were laced with a yearning that I could not fulfill, not because I lacked the means, but because I lacked the desire for that kind of life. I valued substance over flash, longevity over novelty. I tried to talk to her about it. "Are you happy, Chloe?" I would ask during our quiet evenings. She would wave a hand dismissively. "Of course, Tom. Don't be silly. I'm just tired." But it was more than tiredness. It was a deep, gnawing dissatisfaction. She grew distant, spending more time on her phone, laughing at texts from people I didn't know. She started going out for girls' nights more frequently, coming home late with the scent of expensive perfume and wine on her clothes. I trusted her. Trust was the bedrock of my character. To question her would have been to question the very structure of our marriage, and I was not a man who went looking for faults in his own foundation. I assumed it was a phase, a midlife restlessness that would pass. I worked harder, thinking that if I just provided more, she would find her contentment again. Then came that afternoon, the scent of the crushed freesias on the stone patio. Her voice, light and cruel, carrying through the open door. He doesn't know he's not the biological father. The words didn't just pierce me. They unmade me. Every memory of the last 7 years flashed through my mind, now tainted and corrupted. Leo's first steps. The way he looked at me when I taught him how to ride his bike. The feel of his small hand in mine. All of it, every single moment was suddenly a lie. And I, the methodical engineer, the man who checked every calculation twice, had missed the most catastrophic structural flaw imaginable. I backed away from the door silently, my feet making no sound on the grass. I went around the side of the house, got back into my truck, and drove away. She never even knew I had been there. The freesias lay on the patio, a small, forgotten testament to a love that had just been proven to be a unilateral contract. I drove for an hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. There was no rage. Not yet. There was only a profound, hollow coldness. It was the feeling of a blueprint being rendered obsolete. The project of my life, my family, was condemned. It needed to be demolished safely and methodically before it collapsed and took me down with it. I did not go to a bar. I did not call a friend to vent. I went to my office, the one downtown in a building my grandfather had bought in the 70s. I let myself in, the silence of the empty floor a comfort. I sat at my large drafting table, surrounded by plans for bridges and overpasses, structures of logic and integrity. And in that quiet, sterile environment, I began to think. The shock was a physical thing, a heavy weight in my chest. The pain was a sharp, clean cut. But beneath it all, the engineer in me began to take over. An emotional response was a luxury I could not afford. An emotional response leads to mistakes, to rash actions, to a messy, uncontrolled demolition. I needed a plan. I needed a new blueprint. My first call was not to Chloe. It was to Mark. Mark had been my roommate in college, a chaotic force of nature then, but now he was one of the most ruthless and respected family law attorneys in the state. We hadn't spoken in months, but our friendship was one of those solid structures that didn't require constant maintenance. He answered on the second ring. "Thomas, to what do I owe the pleasure?" His voice was as sharp as ever. "Mark," I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. "I need you, not as a friend. As a lawyer." There was a pause. The jovial tone left his voice, replaced by a professional calm. "What's happened?" "My marriage is over," I stated. It was not a question or a possibility. It was a fact, as solid as the concrete foundations I poured. I have reason to believe my son is not my son, and I need to proceed with absolute precision. My office. Tomorrow. 8 in the morning, he said without hesitation. "And Thomas? Do not talk to her. Do not text her. Do not let her know that anything is different. Go home, act normal. From this moment on, you are a ghost in your own house. Understand?" "I understand," I said. The decision was made. The emotional man, the loving husband, had died on the patio that afternoon. In his place stood an engineer with a demolition project, and I would execute it with methodical, unimpeachable precision. The meeting with Mark was in a conference room that overlooked the city from 30 floors up. It was all glass and steel, a fitting environment for the conversation we were about to have. I laid out what I had heard, my voice flat and repertorial. I recounted Chloe's exact words, her tone, the context. I did not embellish. I did not break down. I presented the facts as a preliminary site report. Mark listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Okay," he said finally, turning back to me. "The first thing we do is confirm. We can't build a case on an overheard comment, no matter how damning. We need irrefutable proof. We need a DNA test." "How?" I asked. "I can't just ask for one. She'll know something is wrong. You don't ask, he said, leaning forward. You're his father. You have access. A hair from his brush, a used toothbrush, a clipped fingernail. Anything. There are labs that will do a non-invasive private test. Get the samples, send them to the lab I'm about to give you the name of. We wait for the results. Until we have them, you are the same husband you were yesterday. You go to work. You come home. You read Leo his bedtime story. You are a stone wall. Can you do that? I nodded once. I can do that, good, he said, a flicker of the old camaraderie in his eyes. Because if what you suspect is true, this is going to be a war, Tom. And she has fired the first shot without even knowing it. Our job is to make sure that when we fire back, it's the only shot we'll need. That was my turning point. The moment I committed fully to a path of cold logic. Emotion was a liability. Evidence was ammunition. That night, I went home and played the part of the devoted husband. I asked Chloe about her day. She told me it was fine, a little boring. She'd talked to her mother. She didn't mention the subject of their conversation. I felt nothing. It was like watching a movie of my own life. Later, when Leo was asleep, I went into his room. The moonlight streamed through his window, illuminating the Lego castles on his floor. My heart ached, a dull, persistent throb. This boy, who I loved more than life itself, was the centerpiece of a devastating lie. I saw his hairbrush on his dresser. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, I pulled a few strands of his fine, brown hair from the bristles and placed them in a small evidence bag I had taken from my office. The next morning, I used a new toothbrush and bagged my old one. I sent the samples to the lab via courier, the package marked with the case number Mark had given me. Then the wait began. For 2 weeks, I lived a bifurcated existence. On the outside, I was Tom, the reliable engineer, the quiet husband, the loving father. I helped Leo with his math homework. I listened to Chloe complain about the cost of organic groceries. I fixed a leaky faucet in the guest bathroom. I was a study in normalcy. But on the inside, I was a different person. I was a strategist, a collector of data. The love I'd had for Chloe was gone, replaced by a cold, clear focus. I saw her not as my wife, but as an opponent. Her every word, every action was a data point to be collected and analyzed. During this time, I began my own quiet investigation. With Mark's guidance, I hired a discreet IT specialist. He came to the house one afternoon while Chloe was out and installed monitoring software on our home network router. It was legal as the network was in my name. Within days, I had a record of every text, every email, every call she made over the Wi-Fi. The volume of communication with one number was staggering. The name attached to it was Julian, the real estate developer, the man with the expensive watch. The texts were sickeningly cliché. They were filled with promises of a future together, complaints about me, and plans for their clandestine meetings. He called her his queen. She called him her savior. They mocked my steady job, my simple tastes, my perceived lack of sophistication. He's so predictable, she wrote in one text. He'll be at the site until at least 7. The house is ours. I read these messages without flinching, saving each one to a secure, encrypted hard drive. Each text was another brick in the wall of my case. Each lie was another nail in the coffin of her future claims. I also started digging into our finances. Chloe had her own credit cards, linked to our joint account, which I had always encouraged for her independence. Following a hunch, Mark hired a forensic accountant. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. A separate credit card account, opened in her name a year prior, with the statements sent to a post office box. The charges were a map of her betrayal. 5-star hotels in the city. Extravagant dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of. A receipt from a high-end jeweler for a man's watch that cost more than my first car. She was funding her affair with our money, with the money I worked to provide, with money from the trust my grandfather had painstakingly built. While this was happening, I took steps to protect my core assets. Mark and I met with the trustee of my grandfather's portfolio. We reviewed the trust documents, which were ironclad. It was a discretionary trust established long before I ever met Chloe. I was the beneficiary, not the owner. The assets within it were not marital property. The house we lived in, I explained to Mark, was not in my name or Chloe's. It was owned by a holding company which was, in turn, owned by the trust. I had set it up that way on the advice of my grandfather's estate planner years ago. It was a measure of prudence, a way to protect a generational gift. I never imagined I'd be using it as a shield against the woman I married. We drafted new instructions, fortifying the legal barriers between the trust and any potential marital claim. We were building a fortress, and Chloe had no idea she was already on the outside. Then, the email I had been waiting for arrived. It was from the lab. The subject line was simply the case number. I opened it, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. I scanned the technical jargon until I found the conclusion. Probability of paternity, 0% 0. The number was absolute. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. I was not Leo's biological father. I stared at the screen for a long time, the two words burning into my mind. 0%. It was not a moment of anger. It was a moment of profound, desolate clarity. The final piece of evidence was in place. The foundation of my old life was officially condemned. Now, the demolition could begin in earnest. Throughout this entire process, my composure never broke. My calm was so complete that Chloe began to misinterpret it. She saw my quietness not as a sign of a gathering storm, but as weakness. She saw my lack of confrontation as acceptance of our growing distance. Her arrogance swelled to fill the space my affection used to occupy. She became bolder, more demanding. "Tom, we need to talk," she said one evening, turning off the television with a decisive click. "This house, it's starting to feel small, stifling. Amelia and Julian are looking at a place in the North Hills with a pool and a tennis court. We should be thinking bigger." I looked at her, my face a carefully constructed mask of mild interest. "Bigger is more expensive, Chloe. You have to spend money to make money," she recited, a line I was certain she'd heard from Julian. "Julian has this amazing investment opportunity, a new condo development. He said he could get us in on the ground floor. It would require a significant capital investment, but the returns would be huge. You should really consider liquidating some of your portfolio." She was asking me to give our money, my family's money, to her lover. The audacity was breathtaking. "I'll think about it," I said, my voice even. It was the calmest I had ever been. She took my noncommittal response as a victory. She smiled, a triumphant little smirk. She had no idea she was trying to leverage a man who knew everything. She was playing checkers while I was playing a game she couldn't even see. Her mother, Eleanor, became a more frequent visitor. She and Chloe would sit in the kitchen, their voices low but carrying, filled with disdain for me. "He just doesn't have the drive, Chloe," I heard Eleanor say one afternoon. "A man should be a killer. Thomas is a builder. It's so pedestrian." They thought I was in the garage, but I was in the study, listening to every word through a baby monitor I had repurposed. They were a Greek chorus, narrating her folly, encouraging her toward the cliff's edge. The inevitable finally came about a month after I received the DNA results. She sat me down in the living room, the same room where I had proposed to her. Her expression was a practiced mix of sorrow and resolve. "Tom, this isn't working anymore," she said. "I'm not happy. I think I want a divorce." I did not react. I simply nodded, as if I were accepting a project update from a subordinate. I see. Her composure seemed to falter for a second. She had expected tears, or anger, or pleading. My stillness unnerved her, but she recovered quickly, pressing her advantage. A few days later, I was served with papers. I read through the demands from her lawyer. She wanted the house, full physical custody of Leo, and a crippling amount of alimony and child support. The child support demand was particularly galling. She also demanded 50% of all assets, including what her lawyer termed my extensive family trust and expected future inheritances. It was a document born of pure greed and a complete ignorance of her actual legal position. She had grossly, fatally underestimated me. We scheduled the first meeting at Mark's office. I chose the location specifically. It was my territory, a place of power. Chloe arrived with her lawyer, a slick, overconfident man in a suit that was too shiny. They exuded an aura of impending victory. Chloe wouldn't look at me, instead directing a look of pitying sadness in my direction. A performance for the lawyers. I remained silent, letting Mark take the lead. He was calm, professional, his demeanor a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing of Chloe's counsel. Her lawyer laid out their demands again, his voice booming with false authority. He spoke of Chloe's years as a devoted wife and mother, her emotional distress, her right to maintain the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed. When he was finished, Mark let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Then he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished table. "We reject your proposal," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. In its entirety, Chloe's lawyer scoffed. "On what grounds? You have no grounds. This is a standard, equitable division of marital assets." "There are?" Mark said, his eyes locking onto Chloe's. Some complications. He reached into a folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It stopped directly in front of Chloe. It was a copy of the DNA test results. The words "probability of paternity, 0%, were highlighted in yellow. I watched her face. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving a pasty, gray pallor. Her eyes darted from the paper to my face, then back to the paper. The practiced mask of the grieving wife shattered, revealing the panicked, cornered animal beneath. Her lawyer snatched the paper, his jaw going slack as he read it. This is inadmissible," he stammered, his bravado gone. "It's a private test. It's slander. It's a preliminary finding," Mark corrected him smoothly. "And we will be filing a motion to compel a court-ordered test, which, as we all know, will yield the same result. This document is merely a courtesy, a preview of the foundation of our case, which is based on the concept of paternity fraud." He let the legal term hang in the air. Fraud. It was a cold, ugly word. Chloe finally found her voice. It was a raw, ragged shriek. "You did this behind my back? You spied on me? On your own son?" "He is not my son," I said. It was the first time I had spoken. My voice was devoid of emotion. I was simply stating a fact. The words hit her harder than a physical blow. She recoiled, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. The game had changed, and she was only just beginning to understand the new rules. The external catalyst, the event that would push her from panic into pure desperation, came less than a week later. News broke across the city's financial channels. Julian's real estate empire was a house of cards. He was arrested for running a massive Ponzi scheme, defrauding investors out of tens of millions of dollars. All his assets were frozen, his life of private jets and expensive watches revealed as a complete fabrication. Chloe's golden ticket, her savior, was a common thief destined for a federal prison cell. Her upgrade was not just gone. It had been a mirage all along. That night she came to me. It was a scene I had anticipated. The arrogant, demanding woman was gone, replaced by a weeping, broken creature. She fell to her knees in the hallway, grabbing at my hand. "Tom, I am so sorry," she sobbed, her words choked and desperate. "I made a terrible mistake. I was a fool. Julian, he meant nothing. It was you. It was always you. Please, please don't do this to us. To Leo. We can fix this." I looked down at the woman I had once loved, the mother of the boy I was raising, and I felt nothing but a profound and final emptiness. The structure of our marriage had not just cracked. It had been pulverized into dust. There was nothing left to salvage. I gently pulled my hand from her grasp. "It's too late, Chloe," I said, my voice calm and final. "You made your choices. Now we all have to live with the consequences." I walked past her, leaving her weeping on the hardwood floor. There would be no reconciliation. There was only the final, legal demolition left to perform. The final arena was family court, a sterile, beige room that smelled of old paper and quiet desperation. Chloe had a new lawyer, a less flashy, more serious woman who looked perpetually exhausted. Chloe herself was a shadow of her former self. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a simple, somber dress. Her face was pale and drawn. She looked beaten, but they were still there to fight. Her lawyer's new strategy was to paint me as a cold, calculating man who was using a technicality, the paternity, to punish a woman for a single mistake and abandon a child who knew no other father. Her lawyer's opening statement was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She spoke of Leo, of the bond he shared with me, of the trauma of tearing him away from the only father he had ever known. She portrayed Chloe as a lost, lonely wife, emotionally abandoned by a work-obsessed husband who had sought comfort in the wrong place. She argued for shared custody and, while acknowledging the paternity issue complicated child support, made a passionate plea for substantial spousal support based on a decade of marriage. When she finished, the judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, looked over at us. "Mr. Knight," she said to Mark. Your response. Mark rose slowly. He did not approach the judge with fire and brimstone. He approached with the calm, methodical precision of an engineer laying out a blueprint. "Your Honor," he began, "we are not here to discuss a single mistake. We are here to discuss a pattern of calculated deception, fraud, and financial malfeasance that has spanned years." He started with the paternity. He presented the motion for the court-ordered test, which he knew would be granted. But he didn't stop there. "The paternity fraud is merely the cornerstone of the deceit, Your Honor." He then presented the evidence of the affair, systematically. Phone records showing thousands of calls and texts to Julian. GPS data from Chloe's car, placing her at luxury hotels during times she claimed to be with friends. He presented the bank statements from the secret credit card, detailing every dollar she had spent on her lover. With each piece of evidence he submitted, Chloe sank lower in her chair. Her lawyer objected weakly, but was overruled each time. Mark was building an irrefutable case, brick by painstaking brick. Then came the final, devastating reveal. "Chloe's counsel," Mark said, turning a page in his notes, "has made a claim for half of the marital assets, including the family home and significant spousal support to maintain her lifestyle. However, their calculations are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my client's financial situation." He walked to the clerk and submitted a thick binder of documents. "Your Honor, what you have before you are the founding documents and complete financial statements for the Knight Family Trust, established in 1985, 15 years before my client even met his wife. You will find that my client's salary as a civil engineer, while respectable, covers little more than the family's monthly household expenses. The lifestyle they enjoyed, the house, the cars, the vacations, the private school tuition for Leo, was funded entirely by discretionary distributions from this trust." A murmur went through the small courtroom gallery, where Chloe's mother sat, her face a mask of disbelief. Chloe's lawyer was frantically flipping through the documents, her eyes wide with shock. "Furthermore," Mark continued, his voice resonating with finality, "the property at 125 Elm Street, the home Chloe is demanding, is not a marital asset. It was never owned by my client. It was purchased and is still owned by a holding company which is, in turn, a wholly owned asset of the Knight Family Trust. Chloe's name has never been on the deed. She was, in legal terms, a long-term guest in a house owned by a trust for which she is not, and has never been, a beneficiary." The silence in the room was absolute. I kept my eyes forward, looking at the judge. I could feel Chloe's stare burning into the side of my head, but I did not give her the satisfaction of looking back. She had believed she was married to a moderately successful engineer. She had no idea she was married to a man who was merely the steward of significant, carefully protected wealth. Her entire plan, her entire motivation for leaving me for what she thought was a richer man, was based on a lie she had told herself. She thought I was naive. But she was the one who had been living in blissful, arrogant ignorance. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the documents. She looked up, her gaze settling on Chloe with an expression of profound disappointment. "I have seen a lot in my years on this bench," the judge said, her voice sharp and clear. But this level of calculated, long-term deceit is astonishing. The request for spousal support is denied. Given the clear evidence of fraud and dissipation of marital funds for the purpose of an adulterous affair, you are entitled to nothing. The request for ownership of the family home is denied. As it has been proven, it is not a marital asset. She then turned to the matter of Leo. Given the circumstances of the paternity fraud and the emotional instability it demonstrates, I am awarding sole legal and physical custody to Mr. Thomas Knight. He is, for all intents and purposes, the boy's psychological father, and I will not punish the child for your actions by removing him from the only stable home he has ever known. You, madam, will be granted supervised visitation twice a month, pending the results of a full psychological evaluation. Each word was a hammer blow. No alimony, no house, no assets, no custody, nothing. The entire world Chloe had built on her lies, the future she had been so certain of, was annihilated in the space of 2 minutes. She made a small, strangled sound, a gasp of pure horror. Then she let out a wail of such utter despair that it seemed to suck the air out of the room. She slumped forward in her chair, her body racked with convulsive sobs, a complete and total collapse. Her mother rushed forward from the gallery, but a bailiff stopped her. It was over. I did not look at her. I did not feel triumph or joy or even anger. I just felt quiet. Mark put a hand on my shoulder. Let's go, Tom. I stood up, straightened my tie, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. I left her there, a ruined woman in a beige room, drowning in the consequences of her own choices. I walked away from the demolition site, leaving the rubble for someone else to clear away. I went directly from the courthouse to Leo's school. I was there waiting for him when the final bell rang. He came running out, his backpack bouncing, a wide smile on his face when he saw me. He didn't know about courtrooms or DNA tests. He just knew his dad was there to pick him up. I knelt down and hugged him, burying my face in his hair that smelled like playground dust and childhood. In that moment, the legal documents and genetic markers didn't matter. He was my son. I had chosen him, and I would continue to choose him every day. I was the man who would teach him, protect him, and love him. Biology didn't make a father. A father was a man who showed up. A father was a man who built a safe place for his child. That weekend, Leo and I drove to a large nursery on the outskirts of town. We spent an hour walking through rows of trees, and I explained the different types to him. We settled on a small oak sapling, its leaves green and promising. We took it home, and in the backyard of my house, our house, we dug a hole together. We carefully placed the young tree in the earth, packing the soil around its fragile roots. As we worked, I thought about the nature of things. Structures, relationships, families. They all needed a solid foundation to survive. They needed honesty, integrity, and trust. Without those things, they were doomed to fail. As I watered the newly planted tree, with Leo holding the hose beside me, I felt a sense of peace settle over me for the first time in months. The storm had passed. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to build again, to cultivate something new, something honest, something that would grow strong and true under my care. A structure built on a faulty foundation is not a tragedy. It is an inevitability. The real test of an engineer or a man is not in preventing the collapse, but in having the strength and foresight to build something better, something true in its place. And that is exactly what I intended to do.